In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint Grey Knights. Welcome everyone to another brushstroke painting guide. I'm Brushstroke, and as you heard from the intro there, this video is going to be looking at painting Grey Knights. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that this Terminator in question is actually not the standard GW kit. And that's because it is in fact actually a kit bash between the more recent Terminator models and the official Grey Knights Terminator box set. Now, the reason I've done this is because I really like the aesthetic of the Grey Knights kit, but when you put them alongside the more recent Terminator models, they actually look a bit goofy. So I thought, why not take the new scale Terminator body and add in that cool Grey Knights aesthetic to it from the Grey Knights Terminator kit and try and build one that looks a little bit less goofy and a little more comparable to the newer kits. Of course, all of the recipes in this video are intended to be used across all of the Grey Knights range, not just Terminators. So if GW do decide to bring out a new Terminator box set since I filmed this video, then all the recipes will apply to that just as well too. Now, there's a lot to get packed in on this one, so I'm not going to hang around, so let's get stuck in. But just quickly before we start, just a couple of things which I think will help you get the most out of this video. The first one is, if you haven't checked it out yet, I have a playlist of painting fundamental videos, which are designed to take you through all the techniques and things that I use in my videos in more detail so that you can really get the most out of your painting. So if you'd like to see those, then please click this link above. And then finally, I do get asked a lot about the paintbrushes I use, so if you'd like more details on those, then please do click this link above. Right, okay, let's make a start on some painting. And straight away you can see I've already prepared and primed my miniature ready for painting, and for this I've done a two-step process. I've primed it all over in Vallejo surface primer in black, and then just to pick out the details for the camera to see, I've done a zenithal highlight of grey surface primer again from Vallejo. Now, this step isn't actually necessary for this painting scheme. If you wanted to, you could either prime it all over in grey or all over in black and you'd still get a great result. And the other thing you will have noticed is I haven't assembled the model fully. I'm actually going to be painting it in separate parts or sub-assemblies, and the reason for this is it just makes it easier to get to details that would be obscured otherwise, or sometimes assembling the model fully makes it a bit more fragile and might snap off details that you don't want to while you're handling it trying to paint it. Okay, so let's make a start on some painting, and I'm going to start off with base coating in all of the armor joints and the tubing, and for this I'm going to use some Eshin Grey from Games Workshop. So, really nice simple step just to start off with then. I've thinned the paint on my palette with a little bit of water so it flows cleanly and smoothly from the brush. And the aim here really is to get it into all of these details and make sure that I apply it cleanly and smoothly. So I'm not being particularly neat because it doesn't really matter if I paint over areas I'm going to paint again later. And because a lot of the details or areas that I'm trying to paint in are quite small, I'm going to stick to a size 1 brush so I can get into all those little areas. And because I've thinned it down, I will need to apply a couple of coats just to make sure I build up to a nice solid finish. And then of course, in addition to all of those armor joints, I'm also going to paint in these hoses on the back of the arms as well. Which means we can now move on to painting in the armor of our Grey Knight. And for this, I wanted to go a slightly more blue tint to my armor. So I've developed a recipe which is really simple to do, but produces a really bright silver metallic with that blue tint, which looks amazing in person. So for this, I'm going to use a mix of two paints. The first one being aquamarine and the second pewter, both of which are from Darkstar Miniatures. And all you need to do is mix the two paints together in a ratio of 50-50, and then add that little bit of water to make sure they flow cleanly and smoothly, and then apply it across all of the armor of your Grey Knight. Now, because this is quite a large surface area, I'm going to stick with my size 1 brush. I did think about using my size 4, but I want that little bit more control, and I'm going to paint it panel by panel to ensure that I get it on as smoothly as possible. So as I say, the main aim for this step is to make sure that you get this paint on cleanly and smoothly. So do take your time, apply it as nice thin layers, and apply multiple layers in order to build up to a nice solid finish. And as you can see from the camera here, this is a really bright silver and it looks amazing in person. So do take your time, it's worth getting this right, and apply it cleanly and smoothly. And of course, whenever you get near any of the areas that you've already painted in Eshin Grey, just take that extra little bit of care to make sure that you don't paint over any areas that you already have. If you do make any mistakes, don't worry, just let this dry and you can always paint in that Eshin Grey again just to tidy things up. Now, if you happen to be lucky enough to have an airbrush, then I would definitely recommend that you use it for this stage because it will do it a lot quicker and will guarantee you get that nice smooth finish. But whichever way you do it, you should end up with something that looks a bit like this, which I think is already starting to look pretty cool, and I just love how shiny it is. So to contrast that, for the other silver metallics, such as the gun on his wrist here and these vents on the back, I want to go for a more earthy tone. So for this, I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel from Games Workshop. So a really similar step to the one we've just done with the silver blue metallic. I thin it down with a touch of water on my palette, and I'm just going to paint in these details with a size 1 brush. Now it's quite straightforward, you just need to take your time and be careful so you don't get the paint on any areas that you've already painted. But as always, if you do make any mistakes, then don't panic, just let it dry, and you can always neaten things back up again before you move on to the next stage. Now you will find the coverage for this paint is actually pretty good, especially for a metallic, but I did apply it as several coats because I wanted to get a nice strong colour to make sure it contrasted well against the silver blue of the armour. So do take your time, apply it nice and thin, and make sure you get it on cleanly and smoothly. Okay, so moving on now, I'm going to paint in the gun casing, and for this I thought I'd go for a matte colour to contrast nicely with the metallics that we've already done. And so for this I'm going to use some black from scale 75. Now to avoid any confusion, this colour used to be called flat black, hence the bottle I just showed you, but it is now simply called black. If you are unsure, then you can always check the code, which in this particular case is SC00. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll already know that this is by far my most favourite black. And as usual, all you need to do is add a little bit of water on your palette and it goes on incredibly cleanly and smoothly. In this particular case, I will be applying a couple of coats to make sure I get a nice solid finish, and you'll notice as it dries, it goes incredibly matte and it just looks fantastic. Okay, so moving on, my next base coat colour is going to be to the Crux Terminatus that's on the knee here, and also any areas that I want to be white. And for this I'm going to use some Administratum Grey from Games Workshop. So again, a pretty straightforward step this, just thin it down with a little water and apply a couple of coats to get to a solid finish. Take your time and be as neat and careful as you can. Any mistakes that you do make though, just let it dry and you can correct with whichever colour you need. And I'm also going to take the opportunity to put a couple of coats of this Administratum Grey on all the areas that I want to be painted ultimately as white. And the reason for this is it will mean that I have to paint less layers later on to be able to get to a really bright light finish. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to paint in all of the red details now. Now, one of the features of Grey Knights is they have that really bright, vibrant red. So for this, I'm going to use some Sanguine Scarlet from Two Thin Coats. Okay, so one of the features that Grey Knights have is they have this 50-50 split shield sort of design. So I'm going to see if I can get a nice straight line down the centre of this shield here for my red stripe. I've thinned the paint down so it flows really cleanly and smoothly, but I've thinned it that little bit extra just because I wanted to keep it nice and light in case I need to paint back over and correct things. And now that I've got that line established and it's pretty straight, I can go back in and paint in the rest of the half of the shield with the red, which will take a couple of coats to get to that solid finish. In addition to painting in the heraldry on the shields, I'm also going to paint in other red details, such as the hoses on the arm here, any leather details like handles on his hammer, and also the cover on these books. So just work your way around and paint in all the red details with this lovely bright red. Okay, so sticking with painting in details, for my next step I'm going to paint in the parchments on the purity seals, and for this I'm going to use some Yshapti Bone from Games Workshop. And this step is exactly the same as we've been doing with all of our other base colours. I've added that little bit of water to thin the paint down so it goes on cleanly and smoothly. It is worth noting though that when you do thin down your Yshapti Bone, it does go a little bit transparent, so you do need to make sure that you apply multiple layers in order to build up to a solid colour. Now, Yshapti Bone is one of those paints that definitely does need to be thinned down. Don't risk trying to cut corners and not thin it down quite so much because it will go a bit lumpy and it won't go on nice and smooth. So definitely worth applying a couple more layers just to make sure you get a nice clean smooth finish. And in addition to all of these parchments on the purity seals, I also painted in any scroll details that were on the weapons and pauldrons, etc. Right then, moving on to the next stage, and that's going to be painting in all of the gold details. And for this, I'm going to use some royal gold from Darkstar Miniatures. So for this step, I'm actually going to apply the gold in two different ways. The first way is the way that we've been painting the base coats so far, so that's building up to a solid finish by using multiple coats, and that's pretty straightforward. So I've just added that little bit of water, and I'm going to paint in details such as the cross here, the skull on the knee, a few sword details, maybe the edging to the books and that kind of thing. And then the second way is the way that I decided to paint in the lettering. So I guess the technique is probably more akin to doing a dry brush. I've pretty much removed most of the paint out of the bristles, and I'm just using the side of the brush just to pick out the top surface of each of the letters, just to slowly start to build up the paint onto that surface. So the reason I've done this is because I only want to paint the top surface of the letters so that it makes the contrast between them really strong. So I don't want to risk the paint accidentally running into those crevices. So all I'm doing is I'm gently rubbing the brush across the surface of each of these letters, and it's slowly starting to build up that gold, and over multiple passes it can build up into a nice solid colour. Now it does look quite slow and laborious, and I guess I could have done a more traditional dry brush and done it really quickly, but then you'd end up having to spend more time tidying up all of the edges and all of the overpaint that you end up doing. So this way I think evens out a little bit quicker and definitely is a lot more controlled. So just take your time, pass the brush across the surface and build up that colour, and make sure that you pick out all of those letters. Now I think it's definitely worth pointing out that this is not particularly friendly to your brush. It's quite heavy going, especially because you are using a metallic paint as well. So definitely worth using one of your older brushes that's getting near the end of its life, starting to fray maybe, or split at the end or something like that. Not one of your brand new out of the box anyway. And then finally, if there are any areas where you have overpainted and you just need to correct, then just go back in with whichever colour you need and neaten everything back up again before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so I've done that little bit of tidy up and painted in all those gold details, and that's looking pretty cool. So now I'm going to finish off those purity seals by painting in the seal itself, and for this I'm going to use some Gal Vorbak Red from Games Workshop. Super simple step then, just add a little bit of water to get it flowing cleanly and smoothly, and paint in a couple of coats to make sure you get to a nice solid finish. Try and be as super neat as you can at those edges, but if you do make any mistakes, just let it dry and neaten everything back up again before moving on to the next stage. And that stage is going to be painting in our last base coat colour, and that's going to be all of the white details, and for this I'm going to use some Ulthorn Grey from Games Workshop. And this step should just simply be a case of painting over all of that Administratum Grey that we painted earlier, and it should be very easy to do now that you've got that surface to paint on. I've just watered this down a little bit and I managed to paint a nice solid colour with just 2 coats. And if you wanted to, you could actually leave some of that Administratum Grey showing in the recesses just to add a little bit of extra shade and depth to those details. Okay, so that's all of our base colours now painted in, so it's time to start adding some depth and shadow to the model, and for this I'm going to start off by doing a wash all over on the blue armour, and for this I'm going to use some thinned down Tyran Blue contrast paint with some contrast medium from Games Workshop. And I've mixed the two together in a ratio of 1 part Tyran Blue to 1 part contrast medium. And all you're looking to do really is to get it to collect into all the recesses and the details on the model. Now you could try and apply it as a recess shade and do it directly into those grooves and details, but I find with it now being thinned down that little bit, you can apply it across the whole of the surface, and you shouldn't find you get too many watermarks or pooling, and in the later stages anyway we'll be tidying that up, so don't worry about that. I find it's far easier just to work your way around the model one panel at a time, and then just using your brush, just encourage it into all those grooves and details. If you do find it's pooling up on any of the flatter surfaces like on the top here, then just keep moving it around. It's really thin so that you should find it wants to swim into those grooves anyway. I'm using quite a small brush because I don't want to lose control of this. It's very easy with it being such a thin mixture to overload your brush and flood the model. So by having a smaller brush and applying it at a panel at a time, I find it gives you far more control, and it's just easier to work from top to bottom on the model, and you'll get it done in no time. For areas such as the pauldron here with lots of lettering, don't worry about it being gold, just apply it all over the surface so that it runs into all those recesses, and that'll add some nice shadow to the pauldron, and we'll be sorting the gold out later anyway. And then obviously the final thing is, once you have applied it across all of the model, you need to make sure that this is fully dry before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so that wash now dry, I've got a lovely blue tint to the armour, so now I'm going to apply a wash to all of the Eshin grey and silver details, and for this I'm going to use some Null oil from Games Workshop. Dead easy step this one then, use it neat straight from the pot and apply it over all of the armour joints, letting it run into all of those grooves. And then same again on the tubing on the back of the arm here, just letting it run from the brush and it doing all the work for me, just going into all those grooves and recesses. And likewise on the vents on the back here, and any other silver details such as the bolter on his arm. And as always with all washes, make sure it is fully dry before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so that Null oil is now dry, so let's move on to adding a wash to all of the gold details and the purity seals and also any red details. And for this I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop. Another really simple step then, it's neat straight from the bottle just like that Null oil we just did, and I'm going to apply that to all of the gold details, the purity seals here, that's the parchment and the seal itself, and all you need to do is just let that run over all of the surface and find its way into all those creases and recesses and give it that nice dark shadow. When it comes to doing the lettering, like on the pauldron here, you can apply a nice heavy wash, let it go into all of those recesses and really darken it down, and that'll make that gold really pop. And then finally there's all of the red details, such as the handle on the hammer here and the tubing on the arms and things, so make sure you apply the wash to all of those details as well, letting it run into all those details and add that shadow, and of course make sure you let it dry fully before moving on to the next stage. Now before I add my next wash, I'm just going to add some details to the front of these books here, little outlines and things. So I'm going to start off with some Sanguine Scarlet like we used before. Now I thinned it down and I'm using a brush with a nice sharp tip. I'm just going to try and draw in some nice fine lines just around the edge of the pages here, just to sort of give a nice sort of border. Just trying to be as neat and as straight as I can. Don't worry if it doesn't really work out first time, just paint the best you can and try and get them in the areas that you're after. Sometimes it goes a little bit better than sometimes it doesn't. Now, don't worry if it does go a little bit awry or if it doesn't quite go on quite as you want. You can always come back in with some of your Ulthorn Grey and neaten those things back up again. Apologies by the way for the out of focus here. This is obviously a really small detail and I did try and get in as tight as I could. Maybe if I upgrade my camera I might be able to get a few better shots next time. But I hope you can still get the idea of what's going on. You just try and draw a nice fine line as much as possible, and then you can just come back in and neaten it all back up again with your Ulthorn Grey. And then as a final touch, I'm just going to add in some little black squiggles using some flat black from scale 75. And there's no real knack to this particularly. In fact, actually a shaky hand is probably a bit more advantageous. So all I really do is just get the tip of the brush just to barely touch the surface, and then just let that slight shake in your hand do the work, and then move it from left to right. And if you've thinned your paint down nicely, then it should just leave these little black lines across the page. Okay, so with those book details now painted in, I'm going to apply my final wash now, and that's going to be to all of the light grey areas and the pages of the books. And for this, I'm going to use some thinned down Basilicanum Grey contrast paint, thinned down with some contrast medium from Games Workshop. Now I want this wash to be quite subtle and quite soft, so I thinned it down to only 1 part Basilicum Grey to 2 parts the contrast medium, and I'm going to apply that into all of the recesses on the knee details here, and then I'm also going to apply that as a single coat quite lightly across all of the book pages as well. Now it looks quite heavy as you apply it, but if you don't let it pool up too much and you push it into the recesses, it will actually dry quite soft. So do leave it to dry fully before moving on to the next stage. Okay, so with that final wash now fully dry, you'll notice I've taken the opportunity to add on his weapon arm, and that's because now the next few stages are going to be just layering and brightening up a few things, starting off with all of the blue armor, and for this I'm going to use my 50-50 mix of aquamarine and pewter from Darkstar Miniatures. So that contrast wash that we applied to the armor has given it that really nice blue tint now, but I don't want it to be so strong in some places, so I'm going to leave all of that shading in all of the recesses and probably in the underside of areas or where that shadow would be strongest. And now the purpose of this step is just to reapply our silver mix across all of the surfaces that we want to be brighter and looking more silver-like. So all I've done is I've mixed up my 50-50 mix on my palette and added that little bit of water, and I can apply it to all of the surfaces that I want to now have that extra brightness and lightness. So where the light would be hitting most, so the topmost surfaces mainly like on the top here, and all I'm going to do is paint in the areas that I want to be brighter, so for example all of these flat areas, and I'm going to leave that contrast where it's settled into those grooves to give that shadow. Now because I've added the water to the paint, it does mean it's going to be slightly transparent, which is really good because it means that as you apply this you can still see some of that tinted blue underneath. So you can decide if you want to apply one layer and still see that little bit underneath, or maybe apply a couple of layers to build up more of the silver and less of the blue. It's up to you. You can build up those transitions and blends from the shadows up to the highlights just by adding more layers as you move away from those shadows. But really, you can't go far wrong with this paint because it is just so bright and shiny that whenever you apply it to the surface, it's going to react to the light in the room anyway. So just make sure that you apply it to all the surfaces that would be catching the most light and leave the areas which would be in shadow. You can't go far wrong. And when you're finished, you should have something that looks a bit like this, which is now super, super shiny. Let me just give that a little bit of a spin there. You see on the back there just how shiny that is? That's really, really bright now. So now we're going to add a layer to brighten up all of our gold details. And for this, I'm going to use some Imperial Gold from Darkstar Miniatures. So this step is very similar to what we've just done with the blue armor. I'm just going to re-establish where I want that shine to be by painting a thin layer of this gold across all of the areas which I want to be showing as catching the most light. So I can just go around picking out the topmost details on all of the items which I've painted in gold and just bringing back that brightness and that shine. All the while leaving the agrax in all of those recesses to give that extra shadow and depth. You want to make sure you thin it so it goes on cleanly and smoothly, and like I say, just one thin layer will be enough just to bring back that shine and brightness. When you come to painting in the letters, such as on the pauldron here, I use the same technique I did for painting them, which was the sort of side of the brush technique, but this time I'm going to be a little bit more focused and I'm going to do it in just a downward direction as if the light is catching from above. So just some downward strokes, just catching the very top of the surface just to bring back that brightness and shine to each of the letters. So just work your way around the model, picking out all of these gold details and adding that layer to all of those raised areas. Okay, so with that gold now brightened up, I'm just going to do one final layer now, and that's to all of the parchments of the Purity seals, and for this I'm going to use some Screaming Skull from Games Workshop. So as usual, I've thinned this paint down and that makes it a little bit translucent, which is really good for this. And I'm actually going to apply the paint in just stripes going from side to side across the parchment itself. This is really to try and sort of give the impression of texture, but also it makes it a lot easier to only catch the topmost surfaces and still leave some of that shade in the recesses and in the creases. So I'm just moving the brush from side to side and it's just picking out the topmost areas. And like I say, because it's a little bit translucent, you'll still see some of that brown and ushabti bone underneath anyway. So just moving it side to side, just catching those top edges and painting that in. I'm not looking to make this a solid colour. I'm going to do this as a single pass. And then down the side here, I'm just going to pick out that edge. And just on the bottom bit here as well. And that's all there is to it. Okay, so with those layers finished, it's now time to move on to the final step to this model, and that's going to be adding all of the highlights. And I'm going to start off with the black on the bolter on his arm, and for this I'm going to go for a bit of a high contrast, so I'm going to go for some Gigawatt Blue from Tooth & Coats. Now I appreciate this really vibrant blue might not be to everybody's taste, so if you prefer, you can always highlight your black with a grey or maybe even a more subtle blue. But I really like this punchy blue, so I thought I'd give it a go. Now the aim here is to pick out all of the edges of the black so that it has that nice sharp edge highlight. So to do this, what I've done is I've thinned the paint down so it flows really cleanly and smoothly, and I don't have a lot in my brush so I don't lose control. I'm just going to run the edge of the brush down each of these sharp edges just to pick out those edges. Now this does take a bit of practice, and if you would like some more tips and tricks in terms of how to improve your edge highlighting, then I've made a video on that and it's definitely worth checking out. So I'll put a link up above, and when you get a chance, do check it out because I do think it'll be a big help to you. Anyway, as I say, just work your way around picking out all of these edges with the side of your brush and trying to get a nice sharp edge. Don't worry if you do make any mistakes, it happens to everybody and it's just part of painting. So just let it dry and you can always go back in and tidy things back up with whichever colour you need. Okay, moving on now, I'm going to do the same to all of the red details, and for this I'm going to use some Hellspawn Red from Two Thin Coats. Now for the diamonds on the handle of this hammer here, I was just going to paint the outlines and just do some nice neat lines, but actually it didn't really pop enough and I didn't like how it looked. So what I've decided to do is just simply paint in each of the diamonds, which turned out to not be such a bad idea because where I'd sanded it down to remove a mold line, I'd removed some detail anyway, so this helped re-establish those diamonds on that front of the handle anyway. So I'm just going to work my way down this handle here and paint in each of the diamonds with the Hellspawn Red. And then for any of the other red details on the model, such as on the pauldron here, I'm just going to add a nice crisp edge highlight of the Hellspawn Red just to make that pop. Okay, really quickly, I'm just going to apply a quick wash of Agrax Earthshade to the hammer handle here. Really, it's just to strengthen up the shadows in between each of those diamonds and just to tie it all together. For my next highlight then, I'm going to brighten up all of the seals on the purity seals, and for this I'm going to use some Screamer Pink from Games Workshop. So really simple step this, I'm just going to apply it to all of the raised areas on the seal itself, and as usual I've just thinned it down on my palette just so it flows cleanly and smoothly, and in this particular case I want it to build up to a solid colour, so I might apply a couple of coats depending on how it applies. So at this point I've decided I'm going to assemble the rest of the model, because before I do my next highlight I want to make sure all the parts are in place and I can see where the light is catching on the model and I highlight the right areas. Because the next highlight I'm going to do is going to be to all of the metallics. So that's the silver blue armour itself and all of the gold details and all of the silver gunmetal details too, and for this I'm going to use some chrome from Vallejo. Now this paint is actually an airbrush paint, which means that you can use it pretty much straight out of the bottle and you won't need to thin it down. I really love this paint because it is such a bright shiny silver, and it means you can basically use it to highlight any metallic, which is exactly what I'm going to do on this model. So I'm going to do all of the metallic silver blue armor to start with, which on camera doesn't look like it's making much effect because it looks so shiny already. But all I'm doing is I'm working my way around all of the armor panels. I'm picking out just the topmost edges where the light would be catching the most. And all it does really is it just adds that extra little bit of definition to those panels and makes it look a bit more 3D and just exaggerates the shine on each of those panels. So like I say, you don't need to do every edge, just the ones where the light will be hitting the most from that top direction. And then it's exactly the same thing on all of the gold and silver details as well. Just pick out those topmost edges and don't forget obviously all of those little rivets as well. Now it is a little bit time consuming, but it is worth doing well, so do take your time and don't rush. Obviously again, as I always say, if you do make any mistakes, don't panic. It's very easy just to let it dry and tidy things back up again and then move on to the next panel. Okay, so with all of our metallics now edge highlighted, it's time to move on to the last few steps, and the first one of those is going to be adding those little squiggles to all of the parchments of the purity seals, and for this I'm just going to use a bit of my scale 75 black, and again just add those tiny little squiggles in, working your way down each of those parchments. And then as a final finishing touch just to those purity seals, I'm going to add a little edge highlight of some pink horror from Games Workshop to all of those seals. And this is just at the very topmost edges, generally just to bring out those details and to really make them pop. And with those purity seals finished, that's my Grey Knight Terminator complete. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. If you have, then please do hit that like button and drop a comment below to let me know what you thought of it. For details on everything I've used in this video, from the paints, materials, model, etc., then please do check out the links in the description below. You'll also find that those links will provide you with discounts on a lot of items as well. And of course, a massive thank you to my channel members whose names are going across the screen now. Your support for the channel is very much appreciated. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to click the notification bell to be told whenever I post another video. Speaking of other videos, I'd love it if you stayed on the channel, so why not stay and watch a video on how you could add some battle damage to your Grey Knights, or perhaps some different basing options you could use for them too.